In this presentation, we're going to discuss how you would go about extracting an argument from a particular reading. We need to learn how to extract the argument from a reading so that way we can make sure we understand exactly what the argument is. That's kind of a really important step that we need to understand how to do if we're going to criticize or evaluate the argument, right? So we need to make sure that we understand what the author is actually arguing. And there's a couple different ways in which we can go about figuring that part out. And so this video is just going to help you go about those different steps and figuring out how you would extract the argument, and then a little bit about how we could criticize the argument. And we're going to primarily focus on an argument that Mill offers in the reading that you had. And once we extract the argument, we're going to discuss validity and soundness, and then a particular kind of fallacy that will come up. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at that passage in the reading that you had and see what it says. So here it says, "The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. And so the other sources of our experience," right? "In like manner, I apprehend the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. If the end which the ultimate doctrine produced it to itself were not, in theory and in practice, acknowledged to be an end, then nothing could ever convince any person that it was so. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. This, however, being a fact, we have not only all the proof which the case admits, but all of which it is possible to require, that happiness is a good, that each person's happiness is a good to that person, and the general happiness, therefore, a good to the aggregate of all persons. Happiness has made out its title as one of the ends of conduct, and consequently of the criteria of morality." So that's kind of a difficult passage. There's a lot going on in this particular passage. And so one of the things that I've done to sort of start helping you figure out some things to think about, some things to identify when you're reading a passage like this, are the words that I've highlighted and underlined. So the first thing that you want to notice are certain giveaway words, or words that indicate something like a conclusion or maybe a premise. And remember that a premise is what provides support for the conclusion. So one thing that we can think about is, how would I identify the conclusion? Identify that first, and then we can see what sort of sentences, what statements are being used to support that conclusion. So notice here, I've got the word therefore. That word is an obvious word that indicates what follows is a conclusion. Notice right here, I've got a so. This actually is kind of a weird situation. This so kind of indicates a sub-conclusion, or sort of an inference that's made, but not the main conclusion that's being argued for. But this word actually indicates a conjunction. It works the same way as an and. So it's combining two different things together. The word fact here indicates a premise, right? The author, Mill, is basically saying, look, I'm telling you something is a fact. And we can identify that fact and then use the truth of that fact, if it really is a fact, to then support what is trying to be argued for, the conclusion, right? We take the truth of some fact and we try to transfer the truth to the conclusion. And that is an indication that what follows is some premise, or maybe a belief that somebody has. The preface that oftentimes is used right before some statement or belief that somebody holds. So somebody might say, Smith believes that the earth is spherical. Smith desires that Trump lose the election. Susie Jane hopes that it's going to be a beautiful night. The word that often indicates that, we've got a truth-apt sentence or statement that's going to follow it. The word if and then, I've actually inserted the then there because it's there, it's just not in the actual text. If such and such is the case, then something else will follow. If A, then B. So we'll look at that in more detail too. So that's just one way that we can start sort of appreciating or approaching some passage when you're doing your reading is by trying to identify these different terms. All right, so now let's go on and talk about this argument in a little bit more detail. The first thing that we want to think about is, well, what is the actual goal that the author, Mill, has in mind? Like, what is it that Mill is trying to argue for? Like, what's the main sort of purpose? In this case, Mill is trying to show us that the greatest happiness principle is something that we should accept. So here, the greatest happiness principle or the utility principle can be stated as that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and they're wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And by happiness, it's intended to mean pleasure and the absence of pain, and unhappiness is pain or the privation of pleasure, right? So that's kind of the main thing that Mill wants to argue for. He wants to try to show us why we should accept that. But notice that that statement's not in that passage at all. But we can kind of just infer that this is what he's aiming for by some of the other things he says in other passages in the text right before and right afterwards. So then we can think about what is the strategy that the author is going to use. In this case, the strategy that Mill employs involves two different steps. The first step is to get us to think or to believe, to accept that the greatest happiness principle is at least one of the criteria of morality. So if he can establish that, then the next step, the second step, will be to show that actually the greatest happiness principle is the only criteria of morality. All other criteria or principles of morality are sort of instrumentally good insofar as they lead towards or they generate, they push us in the direction of the greatest happiness principle. But ultimately, it's the greatest happiness principle, according to Mill, that is the sole or only criteria for morality. So that's the kind of the goal and the strategy that we want to have in mind, kind of in the background when we're thinking about what this argument is and how to extract it. So now that we have that in place, we need to think about, well, what is the conclusion that Mill's arguing for in this case? Well, the conclusion is going to be the first step. It's sort of like getting us to believe or accept that first step. And so that first step says that the greatest happiness principle is at least one of the criteria of morality. And we can think about how that conclusion would look in the passage with regard to this particular quote right here. The greatest happiness principle, therefore, is a good to the aggregate of all persons, right? It's at least one of the goods with regard to morality. So that's what he means by a good. Also, this is a really easy conclusion to identify because we have this term, therefore, right? That the term therefore is indicating to us that what follows is the conclusion. We have other terms like hence, thus, so, in conclusion, it follows that, this means that. These sort of terms tell us that what is going to follow is the conclusion, is the main thing being argued for. Or maybe in some situations, it's like a sub-conclusion. It's a auxiliary conclusion that needs to be used as a premise to argue for the main conclusion. So happiness is a good for everyone. Everyone thinks that happiness is a good to them. That is the main conclusion, that first step that Mill wants us to accept in order to then accept the second step, right? And like I was kind of mentioning before when we were looking at the passage, we can also look for premise indicating terms like that, fact, but, and, if, then. There's lots of different ones, and sometimes it's not going to be really easy or obvious to tell what the premises are. That's why we should try to identify the conclusion first, and then through a process of elimination, we can try to establish what the premises are. Because again, the premises are going to be providing support for the conclusion. All right, so now let's think about what the setup of this argument is going to look like. Mill does a little bit of setup in this passage. So we need to think about how the goal is to show that people actually do desire happiness, right? That's the main thing that we want to show, right? It is at least one of the goods that people desire. So he's going to indicate some examples, right? We're going to think about some other ways in which this would work out with other situations. So on the one hand, I could say, or I can ask, well, how could I go about proving that there's coffee on my desk, right? Well, I could say, If there's people who actually see the coffee on my desk, well, then it's visible. I can prove that there's coffee on my desk because it's visible, right? So people actually do see it. Therefore, it is visible to us. Another sort of example is, how could I go about proving that my voice is audible, right? How could I go about proving that you could actually hear me? Well, if you actually do hear me, if you in fact do hear the words coming out of my mouth, then my voice is audible. So then how could we go about proving that something is desirable? By analogy, we could say, analogy with vision or analogy with hearing, we could say that we can prove that something is desirable if there are actually people out there that desire that thing, whatever that thing might be. Here, I just say, I can prove that X is desirable if people actually do desire X. So then we just fill in the blank, right? Whatever it is that we want to say. So then how do we prove that happiness is desirable, right? We put happiness in for the X. Well, if people in fact do actually desire happiness, then by analogy with vision, an analogy with hearing, and many other sort of examples we can think about, if people actually do desire happiness, then happiness is desirable. That's sort of the general setup that that Mill is offering us at the beginning of that passage. Now, of course, this isn't the actual argument itself. It's a sort of preliminary argument, if you will. It's a way to think about what he's going to do by analogy with vision or with hearing. All right, so now let's think about that conditional statement that we saw. We want to think about how this works. And remember that in the passage we read, it said, if the end which the ultimate doctrine proposes to itself were not, in theory and in practice, acknowledged to be an end, a good, then nothing could ever convince any person that it was so. And remember, I put the then in there because what we have here is really an if-then conditional statement. So that looks like something like this. If A, then B, where we plug in for A, the end which the ultimate doctrine proposes itself were not, and for the B, we put in what comes in after the then. Nothing could ever convince any person that it was so. All right, so that's the general way that we construct a conditional statement of this sort of form. But notice that if I can show that not B is true, right? If we have A, then we get B. But if I can show that not B is true, then I'm allowed to infer not A. So think about how that would work with the particular conditional that we have here. So we could say, if the greatest happiness is not one of the criteria of morality, then it would be impossible to convince anyone that it is. That's another way we can kind of think about what this conditional statement says. If the end which the ultimate doctrine proposes itself were not, in theory and in practice, acknowledged to be an end, then nothing could ever convince any person that it was so. I've just gone ahead and paraphrased that conditional statement as saying, if the greatest happiness principle is not one of the criteria of morality, then it would be impossible to convince anyone that it is. And remember, Mill wants to show that it is one of the criteria of morality. So if we can show that that it is possible to convince people that it is, then we can negate that first part, the part that says that it's not one of the criteria of morality. So Mill thinks, well, it's clearly the case that we can show people or we can convince people that it is one of the criteria of morality. Therefore, it follows that it's got to be one of the criteria, right? That's kind of the way that this conditional statement is supposed to work. So it's at least one of the criteria of morality. That's the first step that Mill is trying to get us to see. All right, so now let's think about what reasons can be given in support of the greatest happiness principle. Mill says, well, no reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person actually does desire it. The same thing with vision and with hearing and so forth. We can prove these things because people actually do see things and do hear things. We can prove that people actually, or that the greatest happiness principle is at least one of the goods of morality because people actually do desire it, right? So it's at least one of them. And so this is the thing that Mill says is the fact. The fact basically says that everyone desires happiness, at least as a good for themselves. That's the main fact that he wants you to think about. We can say, well, it's at least a good in that sense. At minimum, it's a good insofar as everyone desires it. Everyone desires to be happy, right? That's a good for themselves. That's to say that each person's happiness is a good to that person, right? My happiness is a good to me. Your happiness is a good to you. This is the kind of way that Mill puts this point. Now, we might disagree with Mill, but as far as the argument goes, this is the fact that Mill thinks we should all accept. So now that we have this fact in place, we're going to use it as a premise, and we can now construct the argument. We've identified sort of the setup, we've identified what the conclusion is, we've identified the main fact that Mill is going to use to try to argue for the conclusion. So now we have the opportunity to construct the argument. So the first premise just is people desire to be happy, right? That's the kind of the fact that Mill thinks we should all accept. Everybody desires to be happy. Well, happiness is therefore desirable, right? If X is desirable, people actually do desire X, then it's desirable. So we can use that as a premise. If X is desirable, then X is a good, right? If somebody desires chocolate, then chocolate is a good. If somebody desires education, then education is a good. So then we can say, well, if people desire happiness, then happiness is a good. And again, Mill thinks that it's just an obvious fact that people do desire happiness. So since if X is desirable, then X is a good as a premise, then we can plug in happiness for X, and we can then derive a sort of a preliminary or an auxiliary premise that says happiness is a good. Now, the next step is going to be each person's happiness is a good to that person, right? My happiness is a good to me. Your happiness is a good to you. Remember, that's the way in which Mill sort of describes this fact that everybody desires to be happy. If we desire, it's a good to us. So each person's happiness is a good to that person. So then what Mill is going to say is that given that premise, people desire the general happiness. It's not just simply that I desire my happiness for me, but I desire that there is the most happiness possible, right? We desire for people to be happy, generally speaking. So the general happiness is a good, right? If people desire the general happiness, we can plug that in for X, and then we can once again say the general happiness is a good. So given the way that Mill is describing this, then we can say that the general happiness is a good. Insofar as I desire happiness for myself, you desire happiness for yourself. We all desire happiness in one way or another, according to Mill. So then we can plug that in for the X, and we can get this conclusion that says the general happiness is also a good. Now, according to Mill, what he wants to say is, given this particular premise that says the general happiness is a good, then we can derive the main conclusion that he wants for that first step in the argument, the larger argument. All right, so now we've got that argument in place. What we want to do is think about how are we going to criticize this argument? Well, the first thing we can do is we can ask whether or not the argument is valid. Remember that the way that we define what a valid argument is by saying that, well, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false if all of the premises turn out to be true. Or the other way that we can put that is, if all the premises are accepted as true, then the conclusion follows necessarily. It has to be true also, because the truth of the premises will transfer to the truth of the conclusion. Now, in this particular case, it looks like a pretty straightforward modus ponens type of an argument. There's a couple of sub-conclusions, but otherwise, it looks like it's valid. So then the next question that we're going to need to ask is whether or not the argument is sound. And remember that a sound argument is one that's not only valid, right? It has to be valid, right? It has to follow the right rules of inference. And in this case, it's following, generally speaking, it's following the rule of modus ponens. But a sound argument has to be one where it's both valid and everything is true, right? It also has to be the case that all of the premises and the conclusion turn out to be true. If we can imagine a situation where any of the premises are false, right? If we can give a counterexample to one of the premises that would negate the premise, if we can show that that premise is false, then it's just not a sound argument. And if it's not a sound argument, then that's a good enough reason for us to reject the argument. It still may be the case that the conclusion is true, but the argument would not be able to establish the truth of the conclusion. It would be not a good argument. In this case, let's just go ahead and just grant that that all of these premises are true. It may turn out that we have reason to reject some of them, but for our purposes, let's just go ahead and just accept that they're true. Another thing that we can do is we can look for any logical errors or logical fallacies. And in this particular case, the argument does commit a pretty obvious fallacy that we want to pay attention to. So what is that fallacy? Well, the fallacy is, sometimes it's called a fallacy of hasty generalization. I think that a better term for the fallacy is that it's a fallacy of composition. And the reason why is because it infers that something is true of the entire thing, of the composite thing, from just the truth of some small part of the thing. Another way of putting this is, one infers that something is true of the whole from the fact that it's true of some part of the whole. Think about the way this argument works. It goes from this premise 7, that says the general happiness is a good for you or for me, and then it infers that the general happiness is a good to the aggregate of all persons, right? So we're trying to infer that the general happiness is a good for everyone by the mere fact that it's a good for you and it's a good for me, and maybe it's even a good for the majority of the people that we interview, right? Maybe everybody that we go talk to, it's a good for them. But nonetheless, that doesn't automatically show that's a good for the aggregate of people, of all persons. That step is fallacious. Another way of thinking about this sort of a fallacy is think about different objects that are composite objects, like this desk, right? So most of my desk right here is made out of wood. Therefore, the whole desk is made out of wood. Clearly, that would be a bad argument. Clearly, there's parts of the desk that are made out of metal and plastic and so forth. So I can't just infer that the aggregate of all of the parts of the desk is made out of wood simply because the vast majority of the desk is made out of wood. So now what we're going to do is we're going to think about that second step in the sort of the larger argument that Mill is offering us for the greatest happiness principle. And remember that the greatest happiness principle isn't only telling us that it's a good amongst many other goods. Rather, Mill wants to say it's the only criteria of morality. It's the main good. Everything else that might be good is only instrumentally good. It's only instrumentally a criteria of morality, insofar as it points us in the direction of the greatest happiness principle. Let's just go ahead and assume that, for the sake of the argument, let's just assume that the greatest happiness principle is a good for everyone. We need to question whether or not it's actually a good for all in the sense that we just discussed, but we also want to know what exactly that would mean, right? All other apparent goods, we might say, are only good insofar as they tend to promote the greatest happiness. So what other goods might there be? That could be instrumental goods, but not necessarily intrinsically good. Consider education. Most people, I hope, think that education is a good thing. It's something that we desire, it's something that we want to achieve. But why? Why do we think that education is a good? Well, according to Mill, education is a good because it tends to produce or promote happiness. It tends to produce or promote pleasure, right? That might be a little bit complicated, but the general idea is that education is a good, but it's not intrinsically good. It's an instrumental good insofar as it's something that we use to get happiness. But it's really happiness that's the fundamental good, or the fundamental criteria of morality. What about justice? Most people will think that justice is a good. It's something that we desire, something that we hope to achieve. But why? Why do we want to achieve, or why do we think justice is a goal that we should strive for? Well, it's not because justice is intrinsically good, according to Mill. Rather, we think that justice is a way in which, or an instrument that we can use to help us get happiness. It's something that would produce or promote happiness. And it's really happiness that, according to Mill, that is the main good. That's the only good there is. Same thing with equality. Why is it that we appreciate and that we want equality? Well, it's because it's instrumentally good, but not intrinsically good. It's something that we can use to get happiness, and it's really happiness that we want. Same thing can be said for freedom. Everybody thinks that freedom is a good, right? Well, why? Why do we think that freedom is a good? Because freedom gives us happiness. Freedom is instrumentally good insofar as it produces pleasure. That's the point that Mill is trying to make. Same thing with autonomy. I have the autonomous right to do what I want with my life. Why is that a good thing? It's not good intrinsically. It's good as an instrument to achieve happiness, according to Mill. Same thing with rights. Why is it that, having the right to do certain things or the right not to be harmed, why is that a good? Well, according to Mill, it's a good because it helps us or it promotes achieving happiness. And again, happiness is really the thing that Mill says is the main fundamental good. The greatest happiness principle is really the only criteria of morality. Anything else that we think would be a criteria or a good with regard to morality, they're only good insofar as they help us or they promote achieving the greatest happiness principle, which is the fundamental criteria or of morality for Mill. So now that we have that general structure in place, let's think about some different counterexamples for the general argument that Mill is offering here. Let's think about different ways in which we can kind of negate the principles or the premises that are being employed, right? Counterexamples can come in many different forms. We can think about lots of different hypothetical stories or situations. We might go out and find different pieces of evidence to try to show that the premise is false. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about some stories that would tell us or suggest to us, intuitively speaking, we have reason to think that there's something wrong with Mill's argument. So the first one I want to think about is Huxley's 1932 novel, The Brave New World. So why is that a particularly interesting case? So there's these drugs that people take in a Brave New World. It's called soma. And the drug soma is able to produce an artificial kind of happiness. Everybody takes soma and nobody experiences any pain or any suffering anymore. And so it's a world without pain or without suffering. You might think it's a utilitarian paradise, right? But one of the characters in this novel decides not to take this soma, not to take the drug that will artificially produce happiness and remove any suffering or pain. And what's the reason for this? Well, for this character, I think it was John, this character says, well, what about art? What about, symphonies? What about Mozart? What about Shakespeare? Many different art forms were produced on the basis of extreme suffering or different forms of pain, different situations where people were experiencing a life of misery, you might say. And it was really, really crucial in the production of the art, you might think. And so if you take the soma, then that gets rid of all of the art. You aren't able to appreciate the art anymore, right? Because it removes all the pain and the suffering. And so if you take the soma, you also you sacrifice art, Shakespeare, all of the different beautiful things that we might appreciate in our world, right? And so this character, again, I think it's John, I might be wrong about that. This character says, well, I'm going to choose art over happiness. So we have a situation where we have something that we desire, something that's a good, like art, that looks like it's a good in and of itself, not simply because it produces happiness. In fact, we might even think that it's intimately connected to suffering and pain rather than happiness. So this character in this hypothetical possible world, the Brave New World, is going to forego a world of happiness and pleasure because he prefers the world of art and beauty instead. Another sort of case that we might think about is Nozick's experience machine. Let's suppose that you're able to hook your brain up to this high-tech experience machine. Your entire body, let's say, gets hooked up to the experience machine. And the machine is able to produce an exact replica of the experiences that you have in this world except for that you can make it the best sort of experience possible, right? Produce the most happiness you possibly can and get rid of all of the pain, get rid of all of the suffering that you might otherwise have. So you hook yourself up to the experience machine in order to have a world of whatever pleasures you want, and it's just as real as this world. The feeling from the inside, right? Your inside experience, your first person perspective of everything is exactly like it would be otherwise. You can't tell the difference, except for it's just pure pleasure, pure happiness all the time, no pain, no suffering. The question is, would you willingly hook yourself up to the machine? Now, of course, there's always going to be some tricky issues with thought experiments like this, but let's try to put those to the side for the moment. Let's just generally think about the thought experiment insofar as, would you willingly hook yourself up to the experience machine? Well, if you say yes, it looks like you are a utilitarian because you don't think that there's any difference between the two different experiences, the real life experience and the experience machine. And the goal is to produce as much happiness and pleasure as possible and remove as much pain and suffering as possible. On the other hand, if you say, no, I would not hook myself up to the experience machine, well, it might be because you think that there's something really important about being connected to reality in the right sort of way, not just having the sort of illusion of the experiences, but the experiences really being connected to the actual world. Well, if that's true, then it looks like there's something that's a good in and of itself, not simply for the purpose of instrumentally achieving happiness, but simply because we take it to be a good in and of itself, intrinsically, namely that our experiences are connected to the world in some meaningful way. So then, giving these different counterexamples, we can think about whether or not, would you take the soma or would you get hooked up to the experience machine? Does this tell us something about the connection between happiness and pleasure and intrinsic goods? Are there other things that we would accept as being intrinsic goods, not merely just happiness? If so, then it looks like Mill is wrong. We have a counterexample to the greatest happiness principle. And so that's one way that we can think about how counterexamples work, right? We can imagine these hypothetical sort of situations or possible worlds where we try to create a situation such that our intuitions tell us there's just got to be something wrong with one of the premises in the argument or with the principle that we're trying to give an analysis of. In this case, the greatest happiness principle tells us that happiness is the only thing that's good. Everything else, if it's good, it's only instrumentally good. I want you to think about how to use different counterexamples as we continue to go through the different applied ethical situations that we're going to consider throughout this course.